The first step is to recognize and acknowledge that you have a problem, and to really let that sink all the way down into your toes. I would call this entering into an extraordinarily deep level of humility. And let that just dissolve and say, okay, there's a bunch of good phrases like, sadly, I don't have the right language for this particular stage, but it is that extraordinary humility. Surrender is another big one, right? Allow yourself to sink into a liminal space, into not knowing. Right? Know that the only thing you can really know is you definitely don't know. And allow that paradox, that koan, which is actually just a really nice description of reality, to sink in and dissolve and settle. Step one. The transition from step one to step two is choosing to then take full responsibility for how it is that you're actually going to show up in the world. I would call this reclaiming your sovereignty. I've described sovereignty in other places, so I won't go into too much detail. But sovereignty begins here. It is, in fact, in you. It is your capacity to take responsibility for the choices that you make in the world. To be able to say, I and I alone am solely responsible for the choices that I make. And the first choice that I'm going to make is the choice to get better at making better choices. And to proceed from there. Okay? And as you continue to expand your, what I call sphere of sovereignty, the space of life in which you can, in fact, actually be responsible. You can actually make good choices in the context of what's actually happening. Then you enter into the third step. And this I might call something like right relationship. And some portion of that is vocation. By the way, as it turns out, I actually outlined this at the fifth portion of that post that I talked about. So this is a loop closed naturally. So right relationship is from a perspective, from a place of sovereignty. How do you begin to show up in relationship in a better way? And of course, generally speaking, these will tend to be first close relationships, but you might think of these as all relationships. How do you enter into a relationship with nature? How do you enter into a relationship with money? How do you enter into a relationship with time? Right? Just all relationships. Can you use sovereignty, these developing capacities to make better choices and to sense what a better choice feels like without having to use knowing, without having to use some prefab schema of what the right choices is that's been handed down to you by probably somebody else's story? Do you build a capacity to begin entering into right relationship? And I should mention, by the way, that starting at the center, like starting with the people who you love, is a really good place to start. This, by the way, will uncork for anyone who's worried about a feeling of meaning. This is where the feeling of meaning is most fully revealed. And an example might thereby be a thing that used to be called vocation or a calling. As you begin to build sovereignty, you will also be able to fill in yourself that which is in fact your calling. What is your right relationship with doing in the world? As opposed to some notion of like, I ought to do something, or I have a duty to do something, or I can tell myself a story that makes sense that I will do something even though I hate it. No, what is your calling? What is your vocation? That's a piece of that step. And of course, you can notice that there's now a really positive loop, that as you enter into more and more right relationship with more and more of the world, this gives you more capacity to build your own sovereignty. You get help from friends who will give you evolutionary feedback that helps you get more insight into where your sovereignty can perhaps improve.
The domain of competence has been expanded.
Yes, that's right. And it expanded from self to other. It expanded into something like a we, like a team, or a family, or friendship. And of course, then as your sovereignty increases, your capacity to enter into a relationship increases. That's really nice, right? So then we enter into the final step. And I would call that step the step of coherence. And this may or may not be a calling for people in any meaningful time frame, but for some people it might be. So this is where you feel called. Your right relationship is a calling to enter into a relationship of collective sovereignty, where there is a feeling of connection to some other people or person, perhaps just one, oftentimes just one, a dyad, a partner, to so fully enter into relationship that you actually learn how to enter into a level of fluidity, a level of honesty, a level of integrity together that has in some sense its own kind of identity. That the synergistic relationship gives rise to a wholeness that is greater than the sum of the parts and is fully nurturing to the continuing sovereignty of the parts. And we find this, I think, if we really feel about what a good partnership is like. I'm thinking here marriage, but it doesn't have to be. That you can think, and in fact, I think it's just proper to think that there are three different entities. There is the two humans and the relationship are all real. And that as the humans enter into their sovereignty and enter into skillfulness in relationship, the relationship itself begins to have a capacity to nurture the human beings. And this is coherence. And it's very real. And in the space of coherence, we are now playing game B fully. And we can begin to enter into larger and larger relationships of coherence.
As that domain begins to expand and include more people.
Yep. But it needs to be taken slowly.
Why?
Well, our generation is still habitually playing game A. And so it's very easy to fall into those old habits. It's very, very easy to strategize, for example. It's very easy to run unconscious old code in how we enter into relationship. And I think my dog is telling me our conversation is at an end. And so
that's a fantastic way to call. Like you've got this is your 2-minute warning, guys. It's wee time and walk time.
It's wee time and walk time. And so that's the story. Like that's, I think, is it. It seems very simple in compared to like we're going to engineer a decentralized economy on the right. But it is actually that simple and yet not at all easy.